Hello, everyone. In this recording, we're going to focus on the meaning of the term bureaucracy. All right, so let's look over what is bureaucracy. Think about some of the definitions that we can have here for bureaucracy. There we go. So this is a definition from your text on page 553. The complex structure of offices, tasks, rules, and principles of organization that is employed by all large-scale institutions to coordinate the work of their personnel. So what I think is interesting of this definition is that you can see that it applies beyond just government institutions, and that's worthwhile to consider. So when you look there at the part about large-scale institutions, could not the definition here of bureaucracy apply to people working at Walmart, for example, working at McDonald's, that would fit into that category, working for a large interest group that we've talked about, labor unions, for example. You could see that in many ways it would fit into that category as well. Now, another way of looking at bureaucracy, and again, we'll focus on government institutions here, is to consider the traits of bureaucracy. So here you have three consistent traits. So when you hear the term bureaucracy and what is the meaning of bureaucracy, you can look at these traits: hierarchical authority, job specialization, formalized rules. And we'll think of all three of those as we consider the meaning of the term bureaucracy. These traits of bureaucracy were observed and developed by this social scientist from Germany, Max Weber. So Weber was one of the early students of bureaucracy. And so as governments started to become more complex and that there became more and more individuals working in government and having greater alliances and support for institutions rather than individuals. In other words, they weren't working for a king, they were instead working for the government. And in that case then, you can start to see different ways of studying those institutions. So Weber is a well-known individual in studying bureaucracy. You'll probably come across his name in some other situations and other studies of political science or sociology. One of the ways that I always find Weber interesting is his work known as a kind of a methodology known as the ideal state. And so you develop this ideal state that's what you would want a system to be like, and then say how far removed from that ideal state would the real system be. So you could use that in lots of different areas. You could say, what is the ideal restaurant? And say, okay, so here's the real restaurant. This is the ideal restaurant. How far away is the real restaurant from the ideal restaurant? And say, this is the ideal county government. Okay, that's the ideal county government. How far away is the real county government? So an interesting way then of a methodology and a study there. And so Weber has made a lot of contributions to the studies of organizations and bureaucracies. But one of the ways of looking at the importance of bureaucracy is to consider the term implementation. And the first bullet point is from your text: the efforts of departments and agencies to translate laws into specific bureaucratic rules and actions. And another way to interpret that definition is on the second bullet point, putting a policy into action. So how effective can that be? So it's one thing to develop a policy. It's one step to do that. And you could have in our system, for example, we could have policymakers in Washington, D.C., members of Congress, members of a bureaucracy, members of the executive branch, interest groups could work in some fashion with one another to develop a policy. And now they put that policy on paper, and now the policy is given to bureaucrats on the ground to translate that policy, to put it into action, implement it. And this is where the separation from the policy and the implementation may take place. And it may start to have a considerable separation. So what's intended in the policy may not be able to be carried out in its implementation. And war is one of the better examples of that. So if you look at, for example, the Iraq War, you have a policy. Now you have soldiers, Marines that are there to carry out the policy, implement it. And what was intended may be difficult to actually implement for some other factors that were eventually considered, but maybe at first not necessarily always considered. At least some of the material that I've read or listened to some of the people who were in Iraq, when you're talking about temperatures getting at least 120 degrees, in which you have soldiers with the intent that they're out almost throughout the whole day, where you would have civilians that may not necessarily be out. There might be particular times of the day which most people don't necessarily walk around. And so now you have soldiers that are out on patrol. What about getting water to those soldiers? The concern about overheating, and how do you deal with those particular type of temperatures? And what other kind of injuries might be caused by that? Just the idea of grabbing onto a piece of metal that's been out in the sun in 120 degree temperatures. Added on to that, you have sandstorms, in which now the sand is gumming up the works of a rifle, could be gumming up the works of an engine. And so now you need additional oil and ball bearings to ensure that there's not going to be damage to these machines. So that has to be brought in. So additional water for the soldiers, additional cleaning gear for machinery. It has to be taken into consideration. And what might sound like an effective way on policy may not be a good implementation. There was one story about privatizing the chow hall. So when food was going to be delivered to soldiers on that were on the ground in particular parts of Iraq, they would say the chow hall is going to be open at a certain hour. We don't want to have the food out here all the time. So if you want to go eat, you have to be here at this time and go line up and go eat. Well, it didn't take too long for the snipers to understand when the soldiers were going to be lining up to get their food. A problem. So it might sound like a good thing, but implementation not so effective. And so that's where you can see that separation between policy and implementation. So there's a lot of times other factors that have to be taken into consideration. All right, so let's go back to those three traits of bureaucracy. Hierarchical authority, so you have a chain of command, as we can see here. And that would be just, we're going to use the Navy as a good example. Certainly a well-known bureaucratic organization. So on board a ship, you would have a chain of command, and people would know who they immediately answer to, who immediately answers to them, and where you have these different levels of communication. As we've talked about with the chain of command before, of course, one of the big concerns is communication and how that communication moves up the chain. Who's in control of what communication, and what does then the commanding officer ultimately hear? So it is an effective way of delivering commands and orders, but then you also have to try to understand how do you maintain good, effective, and honest and open communication, right? And one of the issues for hierarchical authority. Then you have job specialization. So think about all the different jobs in the Navy. This picture is showing the group called the Seabees. These are the construction workers in the Navy. But just consider that if you have construction workers in the Navy, they're constructing in a war zone, or they could be. In our previous recording, we looked at Iwo Jima, the battle in 1945. So the Seabees were called on to start to put together runways for bombers while the battle was going on, while there were still Japanese soldiers firing on the Seabees as they were putting down the asphalt. So you can see here how that's a demanding job in such a really challenging circumstance. But beyond that, think about the people who work on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier. They're inside a submarine, all kinds of jobs within the Navy. And there's all kinds of rules. And there would be special rules that would need to be followed, formalized rules, such as how to wear a uniform. And to be out of uniform could result in a fine and some form of punishment. And it might seem to be rather petty, but could be very important. Look at the uniform. This is really kind of out of date, but if you look at the uniform over on the right, and so the sailor needs to make sure that the shirt is tucked into the pants. Well, if you had your shirt tail out and you were below deck around machinery and you got your shirt tail caught up in the machinery, the sailor could now be injured and perhaps could cause a delay in the use of the ship as they're trying to figure out how to, fix the machinery. In fact, that could possibly have happened as well. So we can then see that there's a reason to have the uniform worn a certain way, and to not wear it that way can lead to, again, some form of a fine, some possible punishment. It may seem to be petty to have to go that direction, but there's a reason for the rule, even if the rule seems to be at times rather insignificant. A couple of observations here about bureaucracy. One of the sometimes criticism of bureaucracy is that they're known to be faceless, meaning that they don't have that much empathy for the civilians that they work with or help, somehow assist, that they don't really individualize people, and maybe instead just kind of look at processing numbers. And so the idea then that they're not that caring, one of the issues raised about the faceless bureaucrat. But let's think about that. This is a good question for chat. Why might it be necessary for bureaucrats to respond to people in a neutral, perhaps even uncaring way? So we'll pause here and you can think about that one. The faceless bureaucrat, not really making this what appears to be a human connection to people, and responding in a neutral, perhaps even uncaring way. Why might that be necessary? But contrast that there are other bureaucrats. So we just looked at faceless bureaucrat. Here we're looking at what's referred to as the street level bureaucrat. And a street level bureaucrat interacts with the public and makes several independent decisions. So their job is to work with the public, and they're fairly independent in their decision making. So let's think about what might be an example, what might be a particular bureaucrat and that individual's job that might fit this description of a street level bureaucrat. What would fit into that category? Street level bureaucrat interacts with the public and makes several independent decisions. So we've got a couple of areas here for chat: the faceless bureaucrat and the street level bureaucrat. Okay, we'll stop there, and we'll be moving on to look at different types of bureaucracies in our next recording.